Thomas Coram Research Unit at the Institute of Education, and along with Libby Bishop from the UK Data Archive, we're running today's seminar. So welcome to today's seminar about oral history research and researchers. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the team who've organised it. So apart from myself, there's Rowena at the back, our administrator, Dee, our communications person, Julia Brannan, who's going to be talking a lot today, and Rebecca, who's going to, in a minute, just tell you a bit about the housekeeping sort of things. The seminar today is part of Novella, which is a study which we're doing at the Institute of Education at the moment. It's a 3-year study, and Novella stands for Narratives of Varied Everyday Lives and Linked Approaches. And it's a 3-year project which is funded by the Economic Social Research Council as part of the National Centre for Research Methods. And it's looking particularly at using narratives in research. The idea behind some of the novella is to use existing data. So it's a lot about reusing and secondary analysis, and particular narrative data. The project that we're representing today is particularly looking at food and family life in hard times. It's using and reusing data that's existing of different archival kinds to look at food and family life. Food's a very difficult issue to study as it's so embedded in everyday life. But on the other hand, it's because it's so central to life and in places and at times when hardship is particularly high, it makes it a very live issue. So far we've been analysing diaries from the Mass Observation Archive, which some of you may know, but also the oral history data, which obviously we're focusing on today. Important part of this work is to develop our own and other people's interest and capacity to use some of these data which is out there, and to encourage people, but also to find new ways of analysing and addressing some of the issues in using them. So the idea behind today's seminar was to bring together people who've both created oral history but also have used it in their research. And both from a producer and a user perspective, there are so many issues to address, methodological issues around accessibility, how to make them more available, how to encourage their use, issues of provenance, ethics, analysis, and any other issues which I'm sure we'll talk about today. So today we're going to be hearing from people both responsible for creating oral history archives, and we're very lucky to have 3 people who have done that. Jane Renew from the Ambleside Oral History Group Archive, and Robert Wilkinson from the Waltham Forest History Workshop. We're also going to hear from Sarah Gudgeon, an oral historian who's created the oral history collection at the Museum of London. From a research perspective, we're going to hear from users of oral history, in particular from Joanna Bornat and Graham Smith this morning, and also from our own project this afternoon, which Julia Brannan will present. So we'll finish this afternoon with a panel, so there'll be a bit of time at the end to have more discussion and ask some more questions of our speakers. But we've also left a bit of space at the end of each presentation so that people can do that during the day. Before we start with Julia, who's going to do her own bit of oral history and interview Lord David Clark of Windermere about his own experiences of doing oral history, my colleague Rebecca is just going to go through a few housekeeping things. So welcome and thank you for coming.
Well, for our first session, beforehand, I'd like to welcome Lord David Clark of Windermere, who's kindly agreed to chair this morning's seminar. We don't often get politicians, so we're going to hold him here at least till lunchtime. However, we're going to conduct a little bit of oral history first, and David has agreed to be our candidate. Although he spent a very large part of his life in national politics, he was an early pioneer of oral history. And he will be relieved to hear that we haven't got him here to conduct an oral history of his life as a politician. David is a former MP and he served for 26 He's had a very distinguished parliamentary career. He is the first Green politician in Britain and was successively opposition spokesperson in the shadow cabinet for environment, agriculture and food, and later defence. David was a member of the Labour government, the Labour cabinet, and he was responsible for the cabinet office from 1997 with the grand title of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. I won't say more about that. And was responsible for introducing a very important piece of legislation, the Freedom of Information Act. But today, David's presence is important or relevant for a number of reasons. As an early practitioner of oral history, author of books such as the biography of Victor Grayson, Labour's Lost Leader, and he's a professor at the University of Huddersfield. He's also, from the perspective of those of us who are interested in food, he developed some of the ideas for the Food Standards Agency that was set up in the last in the Labour government. And now, as a member of the House of Lords, he has an interest in conserving historical material. He's the longest-serving member of the History of Parliament Trust and Vice Chair of the All Parliamentary History and Archives Group. And he himself has spent a lot of time digging around in the archives, both locally for his research in the North of England and also nationally. So, welcome, David, to sit in the hot seat here.
Yep.
So, I understand that you have carried out quite a number of oral histories, that you carried them out in the late 1970s. These were early Labour Party activists born around the turn of the 19th century, early 20th century, and particularly in West Yorkshire, there are other parts of the country. So, thinking back then, how was oral history viewed, particularly by historians? Because I gather you were, for a while, you were doing your PhD while teaching politics, which is a very different kind of discipline from history, but you were doing a historical PhD at the time in the University of Sheffield.
Yeah, that's right. I really got interested in doing the history and my PhD when I was a Member of Parliament, because the Colne Valley constituency really can boast as the first constituency party, Labour Party in the country. And what was interesting was, and Joanna at CS, she's the expert, it was relatively weak in trade unionism. And this made it quite a challenge for the Marxist wing of Labour history at the time to accept that you could have political union before you had trade union consciousness. But when I dug into this, I found that was the very reason why there was a Labour political union, because the men and women didn't have a trade union to fight with. So they formed, outside the workplace, their own political union. And so I started doing the interviewing probably the mid-70s. And these were people who were born in the 1880s and the 1890s. They were not people who were there at the very beginning of 1891, when the party was formed there, but their mothers and fathers often had been. And these people really just told remarkable stories. Many of them centred around that very charismatic revolutionary socialist, Victor Grayson, who won a tremendous by-election victory in 1907 in the constituency. So I just felt that these people had a story to tell. It was as simple as that to start with. And I was fortunate, and I will stop when I've said this, that in both the O level and the A level and at university, although I did a politics and history degree, I really never did history. All I did was economic and social history. And I was really convinced that history should be not only about kings and queens, to use the right phrase, but should be about ordinary people. And what better way to understand how people live than was to talk to ordinary people. So that was how I really got into it.
So
Sorry to be long-winded.
How did you set about it? What were the tools of the trade, and how did you persuade people to take part?
Well, you've got to appreciate that most of the people I was interviewing had actually been born before the motor car, certainly before the aeroplane, and were very suspicious indeed of technology. That was the first difficulty you had to overcome, because I wanted to record these people, to capture their voices, but they were very, very suspicious about talking into anything or looking at anything. And that was a major, major encumbrance, in the mid-1970s. Also, there were difficulties with the machines you used. I tended to use a cassette, which was okay, but was a bit hit and miss it. You're always wondering about how long the battery was going to last. And you were also aware that the microphones were really not anywhere near like as sophisticated as today. So that was the first difficulty. The alternative was to use the large reel-to-reel tape recorder, which I did use at times, but that was so obtrusive, as one colleague said. It was like taking a Morris Minor motor car into somebody's front room. They were this big, and then you had the microphone, and it really was, as I say, quite difficult. So that was the first difficulty, getting people to speak into the microphone. Therefore, when I did the interviews, they all had a preliminary, at least one preliminary chat with them, which I made some notes, when I had to persuade them to talk into the microphone at a later stage. And that wasn't easy. I was successful. I did about 30 odd at the time. And I was successful because they actually trusted me, basically. I'd been a member of Parliament. Most of them had worked for me politically, and they trusted me. Now, that was a bigger obligation on me, because they knew I wasn't going to twist, very suspiciously, naturally. Their lives had been, they'd been pressed in many ways. So they were suspicious, but they trusted me. So those were I guess those were the two problems.
So, quite a lot goes on outside an interview, and then you're coming back to them many years later. Did you have any material, any observations, notes that you made about the interview, about that kind of thing?
Yes, I did. I'm not saying it was as professional as I would like it to have been. Just as going back to the recordings now, I had them transcribed them at the time. But I suddenly realized I wasn't very good. We were all beginners at the game, so to speak. And I was doing the interviews for a particular purpose. But as I was doing it, I realized there was wider application. But looking back, it's inevitable. I'm sure we all think this. Oh God, I wish I'd asked this question. Or why didn't I follow up on that? It was so obvious, But that's just one of the difficulties of being an oral historian. And I think we're hopefully getting a bit better about it as we're becoming more professional about it.
You interviewed some women, I gather, as well as men. Do you think being a man that influenced your interviews in any way?
No, I don't think so. I guess women lived longer than men, so there were more women around than men as it happened. And one got some remarkable stories, about Keir Hardie staying at people's houses and this sort of thing, especially from the women. And most of the women, not all, certainly the non-working class women, had mainly come to the Labour Party through suffragettes. But the working class women, actually many worked in the mill, of course, worked in the mills. So that was rather different in West Yorkshire and Lancashire and perhaps the rest of the country. No, but the women, they talked just as much as the men. Basically, they trusted me. That was the key thing.
What about your political skills? Do you think they were helpful in persuading them to take part?
Well, only in the sense of who I was. And I'd always got on, I knew these people. I'd worked with them. I'd talked to them. And as I say, I'd come back to that word, trust. Yeah. Remember, these very, very suspicious people, you know, they actually saw the local newspaper as the enemy, you know, because they always seemed, rightly or wrongly, to print the stories. Well, it was owned by the Liberal Party, the local newspaper, and it was basic problem, but, you know, for a Labour, with a liberal Labour context.
And what did you tell them about what you were going to do with this material?
Well, I basically, I just told them the truth. I wanted to tell their story. That's what it was about. And that's quite a compelling reason for people to talk, if people get them to trust you. I was on their side. And on occasions I said, look, I need to tell them about your mum and your dad, what they did. And that was the reason that unlocked many of them.
But interestingly, it was only nearly 40 years later that you've actually come back to this material. So, kind of, why now, if you like?
Well, why now? It's a mission. I just feel if I don't write up these interviews, and I'm in the process of doing so now, they're never going to get written up. And I think they are unique to Colne Valley, certainly. And there's some of the stories are absolutely incredible. For example, let me give just one example, not from Colne Valley, but from the northeast, from County Durham, from Newcastle. I was interviewing a very eminent early Labour activist who'd been a suffragette, who suddenly said in the middle of the interview on tape, oh, she said yes, and then I was going to blow up Durham Cathedral. So I said, what? And she then told me how she'd got the dynamite from the Labour candidate in South Shield. They'd cased out Durham Cathedral. They'd worked out which pillar to place the dynamite. And she said, I actually took it in. And she said, I said, well, why didn't you do it? She said, well, I suddenly realised if I struck that match, I couldn't get out alive. And she said, I wanted to live. But what a story. This is the same time as Emily Davidson, from the same neck of the woods, threw herself in front of the horse, or whatever she did with the horse in the derby. So, those are just incredible anecdotes that need retelling, actually.
And do you think, coming back to the data now, you see it kind of differently from then, from that moment when you collected it? A lot of things have happened since then. You've changed, the world's changed. They're all dead.
Yes, that's right. The difference is, I actually do feel, from the way I can see it, I really need to set the oral history in the wider historical context. So when I'm writing it out, I'm very conscious that even these people, when they were talking to me, it was 70 years old, 60 odd years later. So you've got the memory issue, obviously. So I was conscious of that. So what I try and do is do a check against other sources to see how accurate it is. For example, one guy I've just written up, spent 2 years in Wilmot Scrubs and 6 months in Lincoln Prison as a CO in World War I. He talks about when he was in Lincoln Prison one night when De Valera escaped and got away. Now, when I write that up, I slightly corroborate it with Fenner Brockway's account of the same incident, and the two coincide. And I do 2 or 3 checks like that, which I think perhaps shows that basically what I'm being told is not by somebody with a faulty memory. So I think that's quite important. The other thing is, I do feel that there is an opportunity to get other historical points across. For example, I mentioned women's suffrage, 1918, the birth. But not many people realise that in most of Britain, only 60% of men had the vote. 40% of men, up until 1918, did not have the vote in England. And I think it's important to get, and of course they're all working men, to get that point across as well. So I try and put a wider historical perspective on as well as doing. I mean, why am I doing it now? I feel I've got the experience of doing it, whereas 40 years ago, or nearly 40 years ago, I just didn't understand it.
And the time.
And the time, yes. Yeah.
I mean, something you said earlier struck me that I mean, you've given examples of what historically were the facts, so to speak, but also that sometimes people tell stories about experiences that they could not have experienced, that, you know, that of childhood, for example, that couldn't possibly have remembered, but will have been told by their parents or whatever. Do you think there's value in that? Because these are kind of experiences transmitted, albeit they're not absolutely historically accurate.
Yes, I think it's valuable because they probably reflect a kind of overview they had at the time, although we can't remember. I got the one I've just written up. The man's 81, and he's talking about Victor Grayson in 1907. Now he was 11. He can't really, I'm sure, remember absolutely the words he said. Because when I look back, he talks really, his words are adult words, his sentences are sentences of an adult. But clearly that was the mood at the time, and it fits in with other descriptions of Victor Grayson as well. And that's how he remembers it. And at the age of 11, he was probably just on the edge of being, fairly adult consciousness. But I still think it's quite worthwhile putting it in. But you've always got to, I think, bear that in mind when you're looking at oral history.
And how do you select your cases now for writing up? Because obviously some interviews are richer than others. I mean, what makes for you a good case?
Well, I've done 2 up in Cumbria. I shall do at least 3 in Yorkshire. I'll do a couple in the northeast, and I'll probably do a couple in Manchester. I think I've covered the whole of the north of England, basically, there. And I guess that when you're writing it up, and this is a problem, you do actually use the richest ones. I mean, there are some people who really were not very articulate. I mean, these were people who left school at 13, most of them. It's quite amazingly how self-educated most of them were, but there were 1 or 2, especially the miners in particular. The Yorkshire miners really didn't quite have the same cultural tradition that they had from South Wales or even in parts of Scotland or the northeast of England, where, so often in South Wales, the mum would say, my son isn't going down the pit, he's going to become a school teacher. And, the traditional route to Oxford from South Wales, in that respect. So I found that you're sometimes limited, A, by one's own inability, because you pitched the interview too narrow. You were trying to talk about an individual sort of circumstance, and therefore it doesn't actually lend itself to what... I mean, it may be that I do a kind of generic roundup at the end, taking bits of these things. But it really, a lot depends, and this is perhaps a fault of oral history, that the more articulate people are the ones possibly one takes to write about, if one's honest.
Do you ever kind of regret that you didn't kind of interview some of the more powerful people around the place to look at their perspectives set in the context of these the people who you did interview?
Well, perhaps one should have done. I did do a number of MPs, ex-MPs, in the northeast and in Cumbria, and that's quite useful. Actually, in a couple of them, I've got difficulty. We were just talking about it before. I've got them on big reels, and I can't play them because I can't get hold at the moment, because they're too big even going to a ewer. So that's a problem. It's just a simple practical problem. I mean, I'm sure I can overcome it somehow, but I need to play them.
So those are sorts of difficulties you have after 35 years. I don't know other people. I haven't trying to do it.
But I was also thinking, well, you know, if you took people living in rural Cumbria, where you're rural Cumbria, but from Cumbria, if you took the local landowners, for example, I mean, they probably wouldn't have agreed to be interviewed by you, but I mean, that kind of direction might be something that one could think about.
Yeah, I mean, but I wasn't too worried about that because, in a sense, their history is written.
Yes.
I mean, they write their own history. Interesting when I've been looking at the suffragette movement, certainly in Cumbria. I mean, it is just basically run by the county set. And once World War comes, they either join the ILP and become Labour, or they just live their merry lives as liberals. And they write the stories, or the husband. They don't, because the women don't write stuff. But the husbands have written their own stuff. And the trade union leaders, usually have been biographers or autobiographers of them. So they're partly covered. But I suppose if you've been, accurate, but purely accurate, and given a balanced picture, one should do it. But I was on the other side of that time. Still on the other side.
So just to finish off, have you any advice about writing up oral history as you're in the middle of doing it? Or perhaps it's not a good time to ask you.
No, I mean, it's very much an individual thing. It's about style. What I want to do, and this is me, is actually just tell the stories of what people did to get their political rights through, through a left-wing organisation, a representative organisation. Because remember, that's what it was about: independent Labour representation, without an ideology really to start with. The ideology came a little bit later.
So there's a book.
Yes, yeah, but it's a story I want people to read.
Yeah.
And then I want to make all the tapes. I mean, I've talked to various bodies to be put on CDs and then to be available at various universities and also county record offices. I'm a great believer of the county archives. And really, I think that's where people are suspicious of going to university. I mean, I had a school where I'm involved with now. Just got a lot of money for new archives, and you can open it up to the town. But even I find it a bit inhibiting, in spite of all the friendliness, to go into the university. Well, it's quite easy to pop into the county record office. We've got to break that barrier down. Sorry, I digress.
I think we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Now, I found that quite interesting. And actually, from my perspective, it is much easier having somebody asking you questions because at least you're having another input into what you're going to say. So thank you, Julia, for doing that, and I hope it was worthwhile. It's an experiment, it's a change, it's different, but that's what oral history is about. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me. Now, we've got Graham here. What is great about today is we've got such a mixture over the years, between the sexes, and over the whole country. So, in a sense, we're going to get a good overview today. So I'm really looking forward and hope to stay for most of it. Graham is chair of the Oral History Society. He's senior lecturer, as you can see, at the Royal Holloway. And I think this is the interesting thing about oral history. It does stretch across disciplines. I mean, we talked about over history and politics, but in Graham's case, public history, medicine, and the whole lot. So it's going to be interesting. I quite was taken by his point about he likes writing about himself in the third person. I can't quite work that out, but we'll see. And I can't quite work out the title of his talk, which sounds very interesting. I'm particularly interested in fascism. I don't know if it's going to come up, because I was quite staggered to find that Mosley's #1 seat outside the inner cities was actually in Westmoreland with the uneducated farmers, and he had massive rallies up there in quiet towns like Grasmere that some of you might have got as holiday base. He had rallies in the town centre, whereas just up the road, the Labour Party warden at the YHA was training young men from Manchester and Liverpool to go out and fight in the Spanish Civil War. Quite amazing that sort of thing happened. That came out through oral history, that bit of information. But anyhow, Graham, I'm waiting to hear what you've got to say, so the floor's all yours.
Okay, thank you. I need to begin with 2 apologies, or perhaps even 3 apologies, given the fact, as I say, I'm following such an excellent presentation. The first apology is I can't stay for the day because I've got to go back to my university, to our university senate, in order to attempt to be part of a campaign for university governance that hopefully will become a national campaign, and that we can actually start to resist the commodification of knowledge and the narrowing down of universities back to an elite who seem to be the only people who can afford to go to university now. So apologies in advance for that. The other apology is that Libby Bishop asked me to speak on today because my last major project was on family and food, and I'm not going to talk on that, so apologies, Libby. I'm rather going to talk about sort of family history and I swore I'd never do a family history. I think there's a whole load of us that think we never ever engage in our own family's history. It's such a bad idea, finding out about our own relatives. But nevertheless, a few years ago, perhaps 2006, when my father died, I inherited from him a half-finished biography of his father. And I'd done a number of interviews with my dad, never very satisfactory. And I'll try and say why that was the case as we go along today. And this one's sort of thinking about the failures of being an oral historian as well as successes. So in searching this sort of family history, I started to look at public archives, particularly stuff that was online, because like a lot of researchers, and certainly like almost all of my students, anything we can find online is a lot easier than getting out of our pyjamas and actually going out to an archive or even a county record office. So the influence, I think, of online material is becoming ever more pervasive in research, and something I think that archivists and historians need to begin to grasp. So the materials that, or some of the materials that people have been talking about online, for example, there is listed on one site 379 oral history archives that are all online and available. Now this is a credibly Anglo-centric list. When you look at it, I don't think there's a single Spanish, French or German archive listed on here. So this clearly underrepresents by some margin the amount of material that's actually available. And even if we look at the British Library's collection that Rob Perks and Mary Stewart have put together, it's become enormous in terms of the number of recordings. And there's nobody alive today who could still be alive if they listened through a quarter, or 10th, or 100th of what's actually available there. So there's a big question about, okay, we're making this material accessible, but how do we actually get to grips with it? And again, it's something I'll try and come back to. At the same time, archivists like Rob and Mary are recognising the unstoppable rise of oral histories published online. And actually there's now a complete confusion about what an archive actually is. Is it something physical that we can see, or is it actually the stuff that's sitting out in the virtual world? And most archivists are resisting, as best they can, the idea that you can actually even archive online, but certainly things like cloud computing, cloud technology, the idea of being able to upload a recording onto the web and then download it again suggests that may well be the future, regardless of all the sort of technical and legal problems that might mean. I think that in the end is likely to be the future, regardless of, I think it's a bit of Canutinism to try and resist that. But there's more. There's much more than that. There's much more than simply putting a recording online. There's all the life around the recording as well. What Mary Stewart's talking about, the sort of biography of the oral history archive, could be applied to the idea of the biography of the individual recording or collection, and how people interact with it, and how then it generates more material and more discussion and more reflection. Do we archive all of that? And one of the things that Wellcome Trust and British Library and other big institutions have been engaged in is trying to take snapshots of the web and then archiving those snapshots. just think that's inadequate as well. It just feels inadequate as well, given the rapid changes that are going on, particularly through Web 2, the idea of social networking, discussion boards, mashups, online oral history, then being blogged, and all sorts of things going on. So how do we get to grips with this? And what lives beyond the archive, if you like, in this virtual world? So I'm going to look at a case study, which I'll introduce in a minute, but basically, in looking at that, I thought about all the different sources that were available. And the public archives was actually quite a small part of the stuff that I found. And the obvious one for me was the Imperial War Museum, and there was several interviews there that would coincide with my grandfather's experience that I was interested in. But actually, there was tons of other stuff, including commercial material available through the video games industry. And there was this antiquarian, I describe this as antiquarian, I'm not sure if that's fair, but I just think about these are digital antiquarians who do stuff like collect lists of meaningless lists of stuff over and over again, and then repeat them through the web. So there's enormous amounts of duplication going on the web, and I'll give you some examples of that. And amongst those antiquarians and individuals contributing stuff, there's hobbyists and ideologues and committed individuals and people who should be committed. And it's very difficult to sort all that out. And it's something actually we don't yet teach in many history departments in this country. I can't think of any. Digital history is being now taught in Canada and in the States. But actually in Britain, we're probably not teaching that. I do one lecture called Bullshit Detection for Beginners, because there is just so much of this material which is clearly misleading, to say the least. At the same time, oral historians have been generally positive about oral history on the web. They've spoken about the idea that it gives access, and it can access for researchers, and also moves curating to a user-centred approach. So the idea that people can use it and then apply it to their own research fairly easily. It can extend to what Frisch has called shared authority into interpretation. So you can involve, Stephen Hine in Canada is involving community groups in thinking about their own material. And he's doing that through a server, and people can go online and listen to their own interview and engage in collaborative interpretation with the researcher. Doug Boyd speaks about breaking down boundaries and innovation, the idea that somehow we're going to break down boundaries between communities, and I'll come back to that because I think it's an important point. And at the same time, there's continuing questions about what is a raw oral history, should we put up the whole interview, and what is cooked, should we only put up selected stuff? So there's a big debate about the raw and cooked stuff, and Frisch and Lambert are probably leading that particular debate. I think it links into other debates, and you'll hear from Joanna next, and her work on reuse, I think, is important on this. And ask questions that the other researchers probably aren't, but we need to connect those two debates in some sort of way. And then there's some concerns, the ethics of all of this stuff, and Rob's been writing about that, and so has Larson. And also the progressive narratives of, breaking down boundaries that are actually probably suspect. People begin to actually say, are we really breaking down boundaries? And my favourite analogy is in the 1920s and 30s, there was claims that radio and aeroplanes would break down national boundaries. George Orwell made the point that it was pretty quick that people adopted both for purposes of war and creating boundaries. So radio for propaganda and air flight for bombing people. And the other thing is that I think we need to think about is how our own memories and how our own histories are mediated by this digital world. How we then look at history, I think, is changed by what's out there. And as I say, I'll give them a case study. Okay. This is the case. The case is my grandfather who, sailing out of Sierra Leone, 25 miles west by south of St Vincent, met with U-boat 106 and lost his life. And this is from the British intelligence, which again is online. All this material is now online, so all the British intelligence stuff you can actually dig out if you just do a wee bit of digging. And you can see that's That's what happened. And these are the three guys who lost their lives. I'm not sure if that's particularly large, but I'm going to name them. Chow An San, who was assistant steward, aged 41. Yu Chang Tsung, who was 44. And my grandfather, James Smith, who was 52. The rest of the crew, numbering 40, survived. Now, what's interesting when you go online, if you do it yourself, search Silver U, you'll find that the master and possibly these two men, the stewards, survived. And this is repeated through a number of sites, from wreck sites through to the U-boat specialist site for people who like stories about U-boats. And as far as Wikipedia, the Wikipedia entry I've actually changed to say some people believe, however, it's not the case. So just a small example of how information becomes duplicated and almost, you can see why then people then repeat the story, because I can find 3, 4, 5 sites that mistell the story. So clearly that's verifiable. And in any sensible research triangulation, my granddad is alive and living somewhere in Sierra Leone. I just need to check out where. Okay, so that's the first point about how the story is mediated, if you like. But there's piles of other stuff there, and I'll try and cover some of it today. And some of it's biographical and involves oral history, and some of it's more public histories. And there's all this stuff. And that's my grandfather there. So there's all this material available. What do we do with it? How do we reassemble it? Much of it conflicting. And there's all these thought collectives, which is another part of my talk. So you've got sort of commercial interests, and I'll come back to them. You've got the hobbyists and you've got the politicians. You've got sort of people who are video gamers who leave their traces about this history. You've got historians, you've got other commentators, political commentators, you've got the fascists who are also engaged in this story, and digital antiquarians. And in the end of the day, I thought, when I looked through all this material, it wasn't really raw or cooked, a lot of the oral histories that were up there, and I'll speak about those in more detail quite soon, but rather that they were half-cooked, including even the Imperial War Museum's interviews with merchant seamen. So the idea that any oral history can be complete, I think, is an odd one. Because if you think about it, how could we create total history? How could we have someone sitting before us telling us their entire life in that amount of detail? Now, the British Library interviews are heading probably on average to about 15 hours per interview. Now, does that make them a better resource than something that's 2 hours? And I'm really not sure about that anymore, having ploughed through the Imperial War Museum's merchant seamen interviews. Because the bits I want are about being sunk by a U-boat. To be perfectly honest, I've become as obsessive as the U-boat collectors. The other thing as well is that, what I've done with parts of my father's interviews, start to post it up on SoundCloud just to see what happens there, whether anybody uses it, and how it might be connected to the other material. There's also extracts of the U-boat captain who sank. Is this over you? Jürgen Osten, who's a bit of a hero, cult hero on the internet. And the French game company Ubisoft had a number of interviews up on YouTube. They've now started to disappear. The more I'm using them, the more they disappear. It's very odd. However, Ubisoft's own website still has those videos in place. And also there's this fascist group called Shark Hunters, who are an American fascist group, who go around interviewing as many ex-SS men, U-boat captains, and former sort of Nazis that they can find, and they put those interviews up online for everyone to celebrate that glorious past. And then on top of that, there's these unwitting oral biographies of the gamers themselves, and I'll try and play an example. I might not be able to, but I'll try and play an example. Then there's interviews from various publications that people have done about the war in the Atlantic. So okay, that's the case study. My father's account is quite different from everything else that's there, and that's the thing that strikes me most. This is his written account of his father's death, which is, I think, a political account about how the merchant navy was treated during the Second World War. And it's I think it's very common when you read other, both survivors and their families' accounts of the merchant navy, and merchant navy's position in the Second World War. By the end of the war, most merchant seamen felt a bit betrayed, to be perfectly honest, and it was a long time before there was recognition of the role of the merchant navy in the Second World War, probably only in the last decade, in fact. There hasn't been any recognition. So the death of his father, very personally, meant rapid downward mobility, and a mother who was fairly unable to cope with the death of her husband. And it's a very personal story. It's the same story he tells in interview. However, there's a number of inaccuracies in the account. And the most important one in this account is that he always insisted that the ship my grandfather captained was in convoy. It wasn't. It sailed out of Sierra Leone on its own, having been in for repair. That meant it was fairly vulnerable, although there's a secondary story about this, that some merchant seamen always thought they were better off not in convoy. They were much better off trying their luck on their own. Protection by the Royal Navy was pretty limited, to say the least, and the view really was that we weren't going to, as a nation, risk major capital ships in order to protect merchant seamen and merchantmen. At least that's the account from the merchant navy perspective. Now, I'm going to try and play one of these interviews that Ubisoft made, although Shark Hunters also interviewed Jürgen Osten as well, just to give you a sense of, hopefully this is going to work.
When the first British people arrived in Norway, there was a sort of British commander, and I got to contact with him, and then we found out we had worked on the same North Atlantic convoy 2 times, where he was escorted and I was trying to attack the convoy. So we sat together in some hotel in London and drank a bottle of whiskey. I mean, the war with ships is somehow different. You normally don't kill each other with a knife or so. The ships are fighting each other, and if the case is closed, then there's no reason to have any other reflection or sailors will say. Of course, I mean, you had a bad conscience killing people, of course, but it's nothing personal. You don't kill an individual person normally.
Now, I don't know what the original interview looks like, you know, and I've asked Ubisoft for it, but they've not responded. However, it strikes me, I mean, that's clearly edited, and I'm not sure what he says between it, but it does strike me, and it's very similar to the DVD he made for Shark Hunters and the other accounts he's offered to others, that a lot of the material seems to be content driven. It's about how does he do things. This is an exceptional part of the interview, that he's actually asked about killing. He's never really asked about his role in the Nazi party, which he served rather well both before the war and indeed in charge of the attacks on the Atlantic convoy when he came off U-106 for a 2-year period. And he ended up in sort of a major command position. He's not really asked about that. Instead, he's asked about how you use thermal currents, how you attack at night. And within this, there's a self-justification and depoliticization that I find quite interesting. And he's clearly a clever man. So instead, he emphasizes this is a professional job, war is hell, nothing personal. He's not attacking, he didn't attack my grandfather with a knife, so that's all right. And of course, he's always friends with the enemy. The story with the Norwegian sailor is also repeated on the only Royal Navy ship, the only warship that he ever attacked, which was HMS Malaya, 2 months before he attacked the Silver U. Generally, like most U-boats, they attacked relatively unarmed, slightly armed merchantmen, usually in surprise attacks. Now, 1939, not even the Nazi high command could really justify that. So they told their U-boat captains to say that if they sank merchantmen, which they were actually being sent out to do, they should respond if asked that they thought that it had been a warship that they had attacked. By 1941, they'd given up that idea and simply said, it's fine, just tell everybody you're attacking merchantmen. The Treaty of London in 1930 had forbidden that sort of action, and on most of the U-boat sites this is described as idealism. That, the idea that we can have rules of war simply foolish, so get rid of that idea. And later on, a couple of years after the attack on the Silver U-106, under a different commander, would go down to the Gulf of Mexico and sink a merchant oil tanker and send Mexico into the Second World War directly, a direct result of that attack. It was the second attack on oil tankers down there. None of that is mentioned on any of those sites that you look at. None of it's part of the discussion with Austin or Ubisoft. It's not part of Ubisoft's computer game that developed out of these interviews. So in other words, there's no political historical context in which this sits. Okay, so Ubisoft develops a thing called Stealth Hunter 3, which is the most accurate at that point in time, 2006, same year my father died. It's launched. It's the most accurate, historically accurate game, it's claimed. You can be Jürgen Austin, and you can attack merchantmen in the safety of your living room. And online there's a number of fictive and non-fictive biographies. This is a example of a fictive one. This is a guy called Dies, who's an engineer, he says, from Hamburg. And he reports on the 5th of August 1941 in his little virtual world that he sinks the Silver U with some pride. Actually, he sinks quite a lot of ships. And he makes 202 posts boasting of his missions online. Hence the title of my talk. I don't know if he's a fascist, but he's playing at one. So he continues to murder my grandfather online. Okay, I'm not sure if this is going to work. Bear with me. No. Okay. I'll explain what this is. It's not going to work. This is a guy who calls himself effing controller. He's a bit of a wag, actually, in his own way. And what you would have seen was a virtual submarine breaking the surface of a calm sea as a merchant ship appears on the horizon. The commander identifies the target.
Hello there, viewers. This is Evan Controller, and I'm feeling hand and rested after a stint in upstate New York. I feel like a million Deutschmarks. There's the band.
Okay. I'm just going to stop this because it's obviously going to break down over and over again. Sorry about that. But you get the idea of the voice. And what he does throughout this attack, is discuss his own biography, which I think is really interesting. So, how do we, as researchers and oral historians, can we use this material? Is it even ethical to do so? Okay, let me just try and get back to where I was. Okay. So he says the commander identifies the target while beginning to take aim, recalls a youth of early morning football practices, mornings that began with his mother awakening him to the sound of Shady 1985 US hit single Smooth Operator. He hates the song, but its memory fails to distract him from firing a torpedo. He comments that he hopes it isn't too shallow, which I think is a fantastic line. His online identity, as I say, is Effing Control. He's playing Stealth Hunter 3, best-selling Second World War video game. He records his mission, then posts them up on. He actually records them on video and posts them up on the internet. And there's a whole world out there of this stuff that I would never have come across if I hadn't been doing this little sort of case study. Okay, so what are the politics of all this? And who are the commentators and commemorators of all this material? Well, first of all, as I say, one of the sort of beneficiaries has been this group called Shark Hunters, whose president, Harry Cooper, makes these sort of comments. I thought these guys were decent and honourable kids. This is Jürgen Austin and his friends. They don't deserve history to look down on them. Oh well then, let's not do that then. And this complete celebration of this law. And it's interesting, it's actually the Sun newspaper, one of my most popular publications, who uncovered a guy, a journalist called Oscar Harvey, did a piece on this in 2006, and had found the Shark Hunters were appearing at every SS funeral, or appeared at every SS funeral, and were running trips. And they were a bit of a travel company, Shark Hunters, There was actually various complaints on the web that they didn't always deliver your tickets on time. So, maybe not so reliable. And the other group that have increasingly joined in are the common. I'm not sure what we call people who are wildly attached to the poppy. I mean, I think we might just going to call them poppyists. But they've now turned this into another sort of celebration. And in May this year, held a memorial service to merchant seamen who died in the Atlantic convoys. And you can see it was a very religious, very military-style operation. Just the thing that I would imagine former merchant navy men would have hated. Certainly my grandfather would have, and my family would have. And here's the memorial service, the Merchant Navy Memorial at Tower Hill, where you can find the silver U in my grandfather's name and the names of thousands of others who gave their lives. And I'll come back to that as a sort of commemoration problem, I think, in a minute. But again, all that is posted up online. And some of those people who post this sort of material about U-boats also post up the commemoration stuff. And there's an overlap now between the sort of commemorators and those who are celebrating or saying that we should also remember the war dead of U-boats as well as those they hunted. And I'm not sure what the morality of that is. I mean, I should have also mentioned that if you're interested in shark hunters, you can also buy, they sell through a company called PZG, fake canisters of Cyclone B, just in case you're interested in that sort of thing. Give them a mention, as well as other Nazi memorabilia, including SS Death's Head rings, swastika flags, and Hitler dolls. But even more interesting, there's actually other companies who are a lot more respectable now selling U-boat watches. So you can get yourself your own U-boat captain watch, just in case you really want to take reality that one step further. So I think it's a very, very curious world out there, but one that I think as researchers we normally don't come across, we normally ignore. And I think we ignore to our peril. Outside Rome in the last few years, there's been a memorial built to the general who very successfully attacked Ethiopia, and he is now celebrated amongst the war dead and the heroes of Italy. And that's had a very important political rallying, or provided a very important political rallying point for the fascists in Italy. And I don't think we should underestimate the use of the past in this way. These maybe seem as quaint, odd individuals, but actually at the moment their position in the internet is fairly secure and unchallenged. And it's one that I would like to start to address. You can't see this board here, this discussion board here, but what it says, this was a discussion that was in response to the Sun's article, and what it actually says there is typical Jew news. And that was the tone of discussion on those boards for almost a year after the Sun ran the article. So is the response really then we should have, should we therefore respond by the types of commemoration that we're talking about? And what was interesting at the May memorial service at Tower Hill was that the Silver U was mentioned, as was my grandfather. So he's been mentioned in this context as well. And during the reading was, the largest extract was from Woodman's The Cruel Sea, in which Keith Angus, who was an apprentice on board the Silver U, his oral history was read out. I'll just read a bit of it. I might have slept through if my chum hadn't rushed in and roused me. By the time I staggered out on deck, the 4-inch gun was disappearing underwater, and the engineers were still pounding away. The torpedo having hit the bulkhead between the engine room and the refrigerated hold, and flooded the engine room with ammonia gas as well as water. The black gang dropped everything, the sort of engineers, dropped everything and decamped and pushed off a life raft, the boat having gone, all but one of which was dangling from one fall. I jumped onto the raft with 7 or 8 others, all engine staff but me and this Chinese carpenter. It's really interesting. Crew on all these accounts are, have names apart from the Chinese crew. And that's also true in terms of all the internet stuff as well. I think it's something that we need to address. These ships were international in their composition, and we shouldn't forget that, even if they were being attacked by rabid nationalists. The painter had no quick release, it was just tied on. The raft floated like the dropped toast, not side down, and was being dragged along as the engineers tried to release it. I had a knife and began to cut the painter, but the ship suddenly plunged and down everything went and everybody. We came up again, the raft having broken its painter, and preceded us and crawled back aboard. After a bit, we thought there must be a head fewer than previous, so looked about and found a hand sticking out from under the raft, waving feebly. We dragged it out. The owner, the junior fourth engineer, a happy type from Belfast, squeezing, "Oh, thanks, boys." You know, I thought it was long gone. He'd been trapped by the buoyancy of his life jacket. And the account goes on. And I think it's a fairly amusing, moving account. And as I said, it was read out at the 70th anniversary service. So, the idea of both aggressor and victim have become marked in the history, in terms of the oral history, are now appearing on the internet. All this stuff is now posted up by another hobbyist, and so on. Okay, trying to pull all this back together again at the end, I just wanted to make some observations of what I found. And it's been a very personal journey, and clearly you understand it's also a political journey for me as well, that I've realised just what a dangerous political world we actually live in, and how the past is being appropriated, and we've allowed that past to be appropriated, and we allow that past to be appropriated at our peril unless we do something about it. So, on a more academic note, I think the most obvious thing about digital history is the lack of a publishing chain. And that's the most obvious thing. There's stuff now getting published. We can stick anything we like on the internet. There's nobody to stop us. And this is what we're going to celebrate as open access. You know, we're heading towards open access of publication. We'll quite soon head towards open access of data, where academics will also start contributing more and more stuff to the internet. How we find that stuff, how we use that stuff, that's all up for grabs. And that's where the archivist and historian can enter. As well as the publishing chain, we have to think also, the other side of that particular coin is the path of plagiarism, particularly amongst the digital antiquarians. This repetition of false information, I think, is really evident in a lot of the web. And how do we engage in that? I think we should be engaging. I think we should be authors of Wikipedia. I think we should be engaging with it as academics, and we should be engaging it with authority and with thought. This sort of, I said permanency, I should have said temporality, because it's actually the lack of permanency that happens on the internet as well. Very odd, you know, things disappear. That was removed this month, just recently. And so I've started to download it. I mean, it's just typical response, I guess. You download the stuff and you reload it up on other sites. And again, that's one of the features of the internet, where people are duplicating stuff, but trying to save it in other parts of the internet. So how do we save this stuff? Is some of it worth saving? And why am I saving the account of a U-boat captain that I'm not particularly keen on? You know, so it's incredibly contradictory or conflicted as well. And then there's a sort of missing history, as I alluded to, the sort of missing political impact of the U-boat. Well, it's not, you know, if the U-boat, the gamble was that if the U-boats could destroy merchant shipping, they could starve Britain, was the idea. But politically, it was a disaster. You know, politically, every time they attacked a neutral ship, it put that neutral country in a position of having to make a decision about whether to go to war with Germany. It was in the end of the day, it was probably historically counterproductive. But I think that's really interesting, but no one will discuss that question. Few will discuss the ethics. There's a new book coming out this month, actually, on the ethics of submarine warfare, and looks at sort of Second World War in great detail. But that's the first book, I think, in a long, long time to consider that attacking unarmed merchantmen in the dark underwater is probably a bit dodgy, ethically. And the other thing I was thinking about more and more is new ways of working. I would like to show you this, but if you look up Mozilla Popcorn, you'll see perhaps one tool that we might be able to use, which starts to be able to sort of take bits of the internet and put them together into one narrative story, and then other people can remix that again. It may just confound some of the stuff that's going on, but it may complicate our lives even further. But that's where this is all heading, is on the reuse and use of material. And Mozilla are now offering free tutorials on this. The other thing I keep on thinking about is just trying to cross-reference this stuff, and I'll try and just expand on that one moment before I conclude. There's all sorts of questions about, what's online, what's not online, what's hidden online, what's not hidden online, how do we find it, and how difficult searching now is for oral history on the web. And it's getting worse, actually. It's not getting any better. We've lost, for example, the specialist search engine Yahoo Audio Search. I think that's now defunct, which is a great pity because it was one way of finding material. And it's actually easier to find video at the moment than audio. There's all sorts of questions about open access and copyright. Should I be using Ubisoft's videos? There's all this stuff about the thought collectors themselves, the communities of interest. How do we orientate towards them? Have I just generated visibility and publicity for a very nasty organisation today, for example? So all this requires more thought. How is knowledge constructed in all of this? How does oral history online shape perceptions of the past? And I've tried to explain how my experience of who my grandfather has been mediated by this material. Should we be political in what we do? Should we have more history or no history? Because it strikes me that we can use oral history, particularly online, in a fairly, what seems to be, ahistorical way. I think you're right about you need to put it in the historical context, but so much of it isn't. So that Jürgen Austin just seems a jolly old chap. And those are the comments, by the way, by people who view it, put comments on YouTube. Really nice old man. Oh, yeah. So, yes. What would be fair or unfair reuse? Have I been fair to Jürgen this morning? Probably not. How do we address inaccuracy and misrepresentation? So I'm waiting for somebody to come in and take down my correction on Wikipedia and reinstate my grandfather to life. Resurrected again, so that Dees in Hamburg can kill him again. There's curatorial questions. Can anyone gatekeep the web? Or will we have a champion in David Cameron? who will seek out those dark web places. You can see him tilting at that particular windmill for the next 2 years. How do we engage users in indexing? And it's one of the questions, but perhaps when we use this material, we owe it to somewhere that we should actually be recording where stuff is and leaving our own footprints, if you like, through the web. Is crowdsourcing the answer, which is part of that much of a popcorn idea. And what are we offering open access to? Misrepresentation or misinformation? What are we doing with this material? So just to conclude quite quickly. There's an old story that oral history, particularly in the United States in the period David was talking about, was history without aim. In one oral historian's phrase. Are we returning to that? Is this simply just all we want to do is record people and stick their voices into this sort of virtual sphere for other people to hear? Is that sufficient? Is that the project? Do we need to understand those web thought collectives that are emerging? And what's interesting, by the way, is that instead of breaking down boundaries, those are becoming little ghettos. So the shark hunters only really talk to themselves and to like-minded people. How do we engage with that? What's the role of the archivist? Should archivists make more connections, or just live in splendid isolation? I mean, it's interesting. Sort of IWM archive, like the British Library, refers very little to other archives. The British Library's a bit better actually. Rob's got a list of other oral history archives, but there's no real connections where things might be, or no real meta tagging at that sort of level. Should archivists and historians be trying to facilitate accuracy in some sort of way? Should we provide historical context? How do we deal with this? And I'm thinking about this in terms of my own teaching as an academic, but also more broadly as a public historian. How do we address this stuff? And perhaps part of this is that we need to get more micro studies of the type I've tried to describe today. That slice through the web and start to think about the connections, trying to get into the various ghettos and connect up the information that's out there. Okay, thank you.
Graham, thank you very, very much. I mean, I thought that was really thought-provoking, quite challenging, and as everything challenging, there's obviously two sides to it, but I really did think you raised a number of issues that we are going to have to think through now and as we move forward. Now, I just used the word now twice, and I'm very conscious that we have a programme, and a very tight programme, and I think we're due to break at this stage. Now, if we don't, it really is perhaps a bit unfair on the other speakers.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to suggest is that we have our coffee break, and I know that you'll be very happy to talk to people one-to-one and deal with any of the questions. So if we could do it that way, we would give you an opportunity, if you really need to ask Graham a question, to do so, and we'd also be fair to the other speakers that are coming on. So we'll call the break now. I'm looking at the organisers, is that right?
There's a panel session at the end.
Fine, yeah, but Graham's got to go, so, yeah. So I think we better just leave it one-to-one at this stage, and we'll have the break now. Otherwise, we're going to get way, way behind. So thanks again, Graham. I thought that was absolutely fascinating, thoroughly enjoyed it, and it gave me a lot to think about it, and other people as well. So great. Thanks. Yeah, okay.
I'll stay for